Overtime School of Wrestling, High Performance Training by Coach Shannon from the Coaches Education Seminars and the Overtime School of Wrestling in Naperville, Illinois. Here's a definition of high performance training: to achieve sustained competitive excellence while feeding high schools and colleges with ready, willing, and able students. This is the goal of the Overtime School of Wrestling. Why a high performance training plan? Essentially, if you look to the left, that is the reason. Plan for long-term success. Now, in just about every other area of your life, you would be planning. When athletes get injured, there's a rehab plan. When you go to any type of school, whatever grade you're in, the teachers and the principals have an academic plan. The teachers also have a lesson plan inside their own classrooms. Many people that care about their money work with financial people and they create a financial plan. So why not a high performance training plan? And this is, I think, what separates great programs from the also-rans. Program design, part 1. Okay, what you see down there is essentially an annual plan in a circle, and it's parsed into 3 different areas, and I'm going to explain what those words mean right now. Macro cycle can mean two different terms. Essentially, it means an annual plan, and it can mean a quad, an Olympic quad. Mesocycle can mean a training month, and or it can mean anywhere from training 2 weeks to 8 weeks, depending on what type of periodization plan you're doing. Microcycle is typically a training week, and again, that can go from 2 days to 3 days to 5 days to 7 days, depending on what type of planning you're doing with your periodization plan. The program plan, part 2. Now, this is what we would do with each individual athlete and or team. You have a preseason individual year plan. That's when you would sit down with the athlete and go over what is actually going to happen during the beginning of the season. The in-season monthly individual coaching conversations, just about once a month. Coaches generally meet with their athletes and explain to them what's going on. Post-season individual meetings, this happens at the end of the season, so you kind of can recap and evaluate what the season did and how you can improve going forward on the next season. Physical periodization. Now, this is what most high-performance training plans sort of look like in a box sort of image here. There are other slides on here that are going to essentially describe periodization, but quickly, and this is an easy way to look at it, you can kind of see all of the different components here. If you look to the side again, that describes all of the training time periods. Macrocycle generally a year, mesocycle generally a month, microcycles generally a week. The goal of physical periodization is to enhance physiological adaptations. And if you go from left to right, starting in the middle, preparatory, competition, and transition, those are the 3 typical parts of a training periodization plan. Inside of those segments are specific types of training. If you go from left to right again, general conditioning, sport-specific training, and then you can read along the slide and just kind of pay attention to the parts that are different. What I want you to focus on again is in the middle, there's a competition phase. That is generally where you will have all of the competitions. Now, if this is done on an annual basis from the beginning of the athlete's career to the end of the career, they likely will stay motivated, stimulated, and ready to train. However, if that competition phase becomes, the preparatory phase and the transition phase where the athletes aren't actually getting a break, this is what happens a lot of times when athletes burn out and or overtrain. Optimal program design. Now again, this is an arrow form basically of that last slide. It's a periodization form and or chart which describes the beginning of a career and or a season. You would be preparing the body mentally and physically, and then you would go into the sport-specific training, the pre-competition phase, and then of course you would go into the competition phase, and the athlete should be optimally trained if we follow that progression. General training principles. Now here's kind of the crux of why some programs perform better than others. A lot of coaches are either unable or maybe they just don't understand the overload and the recovery principles. If we understand the overload and recovery principles, the rest of this slide will make sense. Essentially, an overload is giving the athlete more than they can handle, and then the slash indicates that there is a recovery period so that the athletes can adapt to that overload and continue to thrive. What happens a lot of times is athletes and coaches continue to overload without much recovery. If we're following this general training principles here, we understand that the recovery is a big part of their adaptation physically and mentally. Because of that, there's going to be a variation in training, meaning there's going to be higher volumes and lower volumes so that the athletes can recover. Again, volume is the amount of training done by coaches and athletes. And specificity, that means we would be training for wrestling. And an example that I like to use with running is our sport is basically in 15 to 20 second explosive movements, not necessarily 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 minute miles. Does that make sense? In other words, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for our athletes to be running 7, 8, 9, and 10 miles when our sport is more of a sprint. It's depending on what age group you're in, it's typically a 6-minute match, and during that 6-minute match, there are explosive movements. So our sport and our training should consist of specific movements designed to get the athlete to explosive movements like a double leg or a single leg or a switch or a back arching throw or an arm spin. Typically those movements take about 1.5 seconds. So anywhere from 1.5 to 30 seconds is how we should be training our athletes with explosive movements. Of course, there does need to be a base from which to build on. In other words, you do need to have some type of conditioning base, but a lot of that conditioning base can be done with wrestling specific movements. So that's an example of specificity. If we do all of these training principles correctly, the athlete by the end of the year and or by the end of their career should be in an optimally trained state. Kind of went over that last slide there, and I'm going to go back to that other one. This is a high-performance training plan. Essentially, it's a periodization chart. There's a lot going on here. You don't need to understand everything that's going on. What you do need to understand is there is a competitions and camps at the top, and this is a blank slate. On a normal chart, you would see that filled in. And why I want to point out when it is blank, because if there aren't a lot of competitions, you can actually have a better training plan. If this thing is filled in at the top with competitions and camps, that's when we actually don't have a lot of recovery, we don't have a lot of adaptations going on, and we don't have a lot of building towards high performance training. What we do have a lot, and most coaches will just have training and then competition. When you have so many competitions, the body actually does break down. And if you go back to one of those other slides, if you remember that we have to balance the recovery with the training. So we need to have breaks with the competition so that we can get what we need. Again, this is a periodization plan. If you kind of look at everything on there, it documents how the whole season should be going. And this could be a useful tool so that you're planning when your breaks are going to be, planning when your recovery is going to be, planning when there's going to be high intensity training, and you can kind of take a look at it and not do a lot of guesswork. This slide here shows general peaking principles, and the idea behind this slide is to kind of explain, what the training microcycle is and what the recovery microcycle is, and then it doesn't say it on here, but the super compensation that's going on. If you look down at the bottom, that first training microcycle, you notice how it's trending down. That would be the overloading, the overreaching portion of training. And after that happens, the athlete should, if they are given a break and or a recovery and there's any type of tapering going on, they should supercompensate. And supercompensate essentially is the athlete responding much better than they did before the training happened, because they were either getting a recovery and or they were in some sort of taper scenario. What happens a lot of times when coaches make this mistake is you see the third dip. It just will continue to go down, or it never plateaus above what is called homeostasis, or the balance between your body being fatigued and at rest and highly trained. And in order for us to supercompensate, we have to recover and we have to have breaks in training. And what I was pointing out there is a lot of coaches never actually get back to homeostasis, and they stay below par in terms of their fitness. If this is done over the course of a season, you'll see at the end there it says improved performance and tolerance to training. And that's actually, when that arrow is pointing up, that's actually when you want to have your competitions. When the arrows are trending down, those reverse mountains, that's when you're breaking the athlete down to prepare them for supercompensation and or a state tournament or a national tournament. Overreaching and overtraining, kind of been talking about this just a little bit. If you look in the middle there, that's exactly where you want to be in terms of where your athletes should be. Zone of enhanced performance and competition and training. This is where we are, building and tearing and repairing. after the athlete is actually overreached, if you go back to that last slide, if we give them a break, they can supercompensate. What happens if we don't give them a break is overreaching, and the arrow goes directly to the right, turns into overtraining. And this is a problem that we have in sport, not just in wrestling, but in a lot of sports, either because we've had too many competitions or we haven't given the athletes a break, so they don't supercompensate and they stay, below homeostasis, and or they never supercompensate because there's either too many competitions or the training volume has never been decreased. So I just throw this slide in there so you can kind of take a look and see you can be overreached, and then it can quickly turn into overtraining depending on if you are a high-performance training plan and or a high-performance training coach. Prevention of overtraining the taper. And this slide shows 4 different types of taper. That pink line essentially is not a taper at all. The green line is a linear taper, and the other lines are exponential taper slow and exponential taper fast. The area under that green line is the volume that has been reduced. In other words, the volume or the amount of training has been decreased while increasing or maintaining the high intensity. And how does that happen, you're asking? When you decrease the volume per the training practice times, a lot of times many people will go into competitions, and sometimes if there are frequent competitions, those actually can act as training and keep the athletes in shape. What happens though is, if you're not following this model here and you're not doing any type of taper at all, because the practices will be, let's say, an hour and a half to 2 hours, and then you've got 2 or 3 competitions, the athlete will be overtrained. And this slide is showing you how to prevent overtraining if there is a decrease in the volume of training, and it can be fast or slow. That pink line is just a straight line. In other words, they reduce training by 60 to 70% from the first day to the 14th day. If you look at the bottom 1 through 14, those are the amount of days of the taper. So the pink line is not necessarily a taper, it's just reduced training from 1 to 14 days, where the other lines are decreasing either exponentially with the blue and red lines or in a straight line on the taper. And those are reducing the volume so that you can increase and have a peak for your performances. Detailed monitoring of competition response. And this is a mental state of readiness and satisfaction form. And what this does is it's a tracking tool and a monitoring tool for competitions. So the athlete would fill this out after the competition, and then they would hand it to the coach, and then once or twice or a month or so you would take a look at all of these different competitions that they've tracked and monitored. And essentially it's trying to figure out and describe to the athlete where they were psychologically. How were they feeling? What kind of stress was going on? Did they prepare strategically and tactically the way that they should have? If they do this over the course of a season and they're communicating with their coach, they should be able to make their training design. In other words, they should know exactly what they need to work on. And this is a monitoring tool for competition. Detailed monitoring of training response. This is for training. The last monitoring tool was for competition, and the RESTO actually stands for Recovery Stress Questionnaire for Athletes. And this is something that I got from the United States Olympic Committee via their seminars, and you can see the author's name right there. I would give this to my athletes when I was a coach at the United States Olympic Education Center about every month or so. And if you look on the left there, it goes over the general stress, the emotional stress, the social stress, the conflicts and pressure. Basically, it tells them how they are feeling and what they are going through, and areas that they can actually increase or decrease to get that stress out of their life. Not only are we stressing them through training, of course athletes have lives and they got a lot of other things going on, so what we're trying to do with this questionnaire here is hone in on things that are actually going to increase their ability to have high performances. So again, that last slide was a monitoring tool for competitions, and this is a monitoring tool for training. Tudor Bompa wrote a book called Periodization, and this slide is an indication of some of the things that he talked about in that book, Bompa'sTraining Factors, and he pointed out these 3 or 4 areas that if we master and or we teach our athletes to master, they can have high performances. Psychological training, technical and tactical training, and physical training. And his book, Periodization, essentially that chart that you saw, several slides ago, it details that out in details. If you go back and look at that, you can kind of see all of these things at the bottom. Psychological skills training, PST. I threw this slide on there because I think these are important. Not only do we have to get the athletes physically fit, we've got to get them psychologically fit. So we need to be teaching our athletes how to set SMART goals. If we teach them how to set SMART goals, there's no indication that we can motivate athletes. We can't give that to them necessarily. But if they create goals and they can see the end of the tunnel, so to speak, a lot of times that is motivating. What also needs to be importantly expressed to the athletes is mental flexibility. Things aren't always going to go their way, and when they do not go their way, that's actually when a lot of growth happens. But this needs to be explained to the athletes so they are aware that, okay, here's my opportunity for growth. And how that can, both of those three areas can be advanced is how the athlete's actually talking to themselves and what kind of pictures they're seeing in their head. We can change those things by explaining to the athletes. You have control actually over what you're saying to yourself and what you're seeing. Once they actually discover that and they figure that out, they actually have much better training responses and much better results in their competitions if they're able to master controlling all of those things that are pointed out there. Nutrition periodization, we have a whole nother presentation just on nutrition and weight cutting, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there. What I do want to point out, though, is this needs to be year-round nutrition principles. Again, if you look at this slide, one of the earlier slides, it just says physical periodization. It's essentially the same thing with the macrocycle, mesocycle, and microcycles. It's just more in line with how they should be putting nutrients into their body year-round, not just during the wrestling season, during the preparatory season of training, or the competition season and or the transition. They need to be controlling the amount of foods that are going into their bodies year-round in order to have high performance training. Recovery techniques, passive rest. Kind of talked about this a little bit earlier on one of the earlier slides, but here is actual data that suggests we have human growth hormones in our body. You know, this has been in the news recently with track and field and some of the other sports, baseball and, cycling. You actually have human growth hormone, or HGH, in your body, and that thing, if you look at the blue line, it actually spikes up in the evening when you go to sleep. Both of these hormones are naturally in our bodies. Cortisol is a catabolic chemical in your body, hormone, if you will. If that continues to stay high during the day, it's much more difficult to train. In fact, when you sleep, you can follow that red line, it actually goes down. And when we're getting enough sleep, anywhere from 8 to 10 hours, we'll have that high spike in the evenings, in the mornings with the HGH. Now, if we're not getting enough sleep, all of the training that we're doing during the day actually can be thwarted. In other words, if you're not getting enough sleep at night, all of the training may not matter. So this becomes a huge factor, and we have to be expressing to our athletes, you have to get enough rest so that your body is adapting and recovering, and so that you can peak for your competitions. The conclusion is, a slide that sort of indicates that we all need to be working together. Overtime staff, the students of Overtime, and the parents. Either any of the Overtime Training Center coaches and or satellite coaches, we have to be communicating with the students. Students have to be communicating back with us. They have to be communicating with their parents, and vice versa. If we're all on the same page and we understand how this high performance training works, we can have great results, and that is the goal, again, of the Overtime School of Wrestling. Just want to point out, this presentation content was derived from the United States Olympic Committee Training Design Symposiums. Again, I was a resident athlete at the United States Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs for 2 years, and then I was a USA national team coach for USA Wrestling for 8 years out of the United States Olympic Education Center. So all of this information that I put forth to you isn't coming off the top of my head. This is actual research done by the United States Olympic Committee and sports scientists from all around the world. You can find out more information, or if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email at sgillespie@overtimewrestling.com. And for any other information about the Overtime School of Wrestling, you can always check our website at www.overtimewrestling.com. Thank you.